Hey everyone, it's Jack here as usual, quickly asking you to click the like and subscribe buttons, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment saying where you're listening from. Leaving a comment really helps my video go out to a wider audience and ensures that I can keep producing content. Now with that said, today we see how a struggle for the sea ended in a river of blood. So let's get down to business. For many years, the great sparkling sea was a busy road, a lifeline connecting the two giants of that age. On one shore stood Carthage, the queen of the ocean, her ports bursting with riches from distant lands, her warships a huge, silent threat. On the other, the young, fiercely driven Roman Republic, a society that preached stern virtues but hid an endless hunger for land and control. Their relationship was not a simple fight, but a careful and often cold peace held together by a web of written promises treaties that were followed only out of necessity, not real trust. This web was destined to tear apart, piece by piece, not because of one big shocking crime, but because of a long, slow series of small betrayals. The Punic Wars, a terrible story of destruction and cruelty almost beyond belief, did not start with soldiers fighting. They started with a lie. To truly see the rot that came before the giant conflict, we have to look closely at those first promises between them. These ancient documents, carved onto bronze, were supposed to draw clear lines. Carthage would rule the sea and the hugely profitable trade routes. Rome would stick to controlling the Italian peninsula. The true spirit of these agreements was meant to be mutual respect, a simple way to avoid a war that would ruin both economies. But the dark shadow of greed, like a rising flood, began to cover the edges of the map. Carthage, which needed its huge overseas empire and a massive army of paid foreign soldiers to survive, always felt the fear of going bankrupt. Rome, which grew stronger and more aggressive with every piece of Italian ground it conquered, started to feel trapped by the treaties that kept it away from the rich mines of Sardinia and the crucial harbors of Sicily. It was a slow, burning anger, a fundamental difference in how they saw the world. One saw the sea as a bank, the other saw it as a cage wall. The first major injury to the idea of a long-lasting peace was not caused by the governments themselves, but by the soldiers they hired, mercenaries. The Carthaginian system, for all its clever trading, depended on paying foreign fighters men from Numidia, Gaul, and Spain to fight its battles. After the First Punic War, which was only a small preview of the horror to come, the Carthaginians, completely out of money, tried to cheat their returning soldiers out of their pay. This was an act of deep, short-sighted dishonesty. They gambled that a massive mixed army of fighters, jobless and unpaid, would just quietly disappear. They gambled wrong. The war that erupted next, grimly called the Truceless War or the Mercenary War, was a horrifying nightmare soaked in blood. It ripped away all claims of civilized behavior from every side. It was pure survival, pure hate-filled payback. Imagine the terror. Tens of thousands of skilled killers, abandoned and robbed of their pay, turning their swords onto their former employers and the Carthaginian homeland itself. The farms and cities of North Africa became a stage for shocking, unspeakable violence. Hamilcar Barca, the father of the famous Hannibal, was forced to fight back with equally savage methods, crucifying thousands of rebels. This civil war, which started because of a simple attempt to save money through cheating, had an even worse consequence. It gave Rome the perfect moment to commit an act of calculated, selfish betrayal that would make any real peace forever impossible. While Carthage was struggling and losing its lifeblood in its own civil war, Rome looked across the water at the nearby island of Sardinia. The troops on Sardinia, also made up of unpaid foreign soldiers, revolted against Carthage and begged Rome for help. Rome, who had just signed a peace treaty recognizing Carthage's control, now faced a simple choice: honor the treaty and let their struggling enemy deal with their internal rebels, or grab the opportunity for conquest. The honest choice was clear. The powerful choice was a direct invitation to war. The Roman Senate, now filled with aggressive new politicians whose personal ambition was much bigger than their respect for fights, sacred Roman idea of good faith, chose the powerful path. They not only agreed to help the Sardinians, but then demanded that Carthage give up the entire island, along with an enormous extra payment, arguing that Carthage's attempts to take the island back were a threat to Rome. This was force disguised as legal necessity, an act of pure, ugly aggression. Carthage, exhausted and reeling from the Truceless War, had no choice but to agree. The Senate in Rome called it clever politics. The Carthaginians called it theft. We now know it was the opening act of a tragedy. The theft of Sardinia and later Corsica struck a deep, painful blow to the Carthaginian spirit, changing mere competition into a bright, burning hatred. The leaders in Carthage, who were mainly rich traders, still wanted peace, believing that commerce could fix what military defeat had cost them. But a new, dangerous faction was rising, led by the Barca family. These were the generals, the men who had suffered and bled, and they saw the Roman action not as a slight problem, but as a total moral insult, a threat to their very existence. They concluded that Rome's single rule of policy was a complete disregard for treaties whenever Rome saw a chance to gain something. They understood that peace was no longer a negotiation. It was just a fragile break between endless conflicts, waiting for the stronger side to break it. Hamilcar Barca, the brilliant general who had brutally crushed the Mercenary War, became the face of this new, angry mood. Unable to attack Rome directly, he looked to Iberia, today's Spain. This huge, wild land, rich in tribes and, most importantly, silver mines, was to be the new source of money for Carthage, the furnace where the wealth and the army needed for the coming final war would be created. Hamilcar's actions in Spain, while securing Carthaginian power, became another layer of moral corruption in the growing crisis. He ruled with a smart mix of diplomacy and savage conquest, forcing the Spanish tribes to obey him and tearing out the land's mineral wealth with a relentless, cold-hearted efficiency. This was not settling a colony. It was building a machine of war. The massive flow of silver from the Spanish mines did two critical things. It saved the Carthaginian economy and, far more worryingly, it allowed the Barca family to build a private army loyal only to them, not to the Carthaginian government. Hamilcar taught his sons, including the young boy, Hannibal, whom he famously made, promise an oath of undying hatred toward Rome that the war to come was not just about land or politics, but about true justice and pure survival against an enemy that had no morality left. This was the planting of a deeply personal, family revenge in the heart of international affairs. Rome, at first busy with its own political changes and minor wars in Gaul, watched the Spanish build-up with growing unease. They saw the silver rushing back to Carthage, the creation of a highly trained army that made their Italian allies nervous, and they knew exactly what was coming. Yet, their own reaction was driven not by any moral commitment to world peace, but by a simple, raw territorial envy. They felt their area of influence was being threatened. The answer was the Ebro Treaty. This agreement stated that Carthaginian forces would not cross the Ebro River in Spain, supposedly to protect the Greek-aligned cities further north. It looked like a success for peace, a clear boundary marked out. But the meaning of the treaty, like so many others before it, was already poisoned by bad faith. The Romans had developed a dangerous pattern of using two standards. Treaties were unbreakable when they protected Rome's interests, but conveniently open to interpretation when they got in the way of Rome's ambition. The Carthaginian actions south of the river, while aggressive, were in their acknowledged territory. The Roman demand to insert themselves into Spanish politics, despite having no real claim to the region, was a cynical move designed to block, to frustrate, and finally to start a fight. It proved to the Barcid faction that Rome would not wait for war. Rome would actively create the reasons for war by constantly moving the boundaries of what peace meant. This constant boundary shifting found its darkest moment in the fateful situation involving the city of Saguntum. This small city, allied with Rome, was located clearly south of the Ebro River, deep within the territory that the Ebro Treaty had supposedly left to Carthage. The treaty said Carthage wouldn't cross the Ebro, but it did not stop Carthaginian action against a city south of the river that was causing trouble for their allies. Yet Rome had secretly made an alliance with Saguntum, an open and willful break with the spirit of the Ebro Treaty, and a clear challenge in Carthaginian-controlled land. When Hannibal, now the lead general, moved to strengthen Carthaginian authority by laying siege to Saguntum in 219 BC, he was acting within the legal, even if aggressive, rights of Carthaginian claims in Spain. He knew Rome would complain loudly, but he also knew Rome's moral outrage was based on pure hypocrisy. He saw the people of Saguntum, backed by Rome, actively attacking Carthaginian allies and trade ships. For Hannibal, the siege was a necessary punishment. For Rome, it was the perfect excuse for war. This single event sums up the total moral failure that led to the war. Carthage acted with cruel strictness to the law. Rome reacted with self-righteous, selective anger. Both sides were simply maneuvering for the upper hand, their claims to moral purity completely washed away by years of dishonest behavior. The siege itself was a grueling 8-month ordeal that became a worldwide scandal, a dark sign of the bloodshed to come. Saguntum begged desperately to Rome, asking their supposed protectors to step in. The Roman Senate talked endlessly, delayed the decision, and finally sent an ultimatum to Hannibal demanding he end the siege. When he ignored them, they sent ambassadors to Carthage, demanding that the Carthaginian government either surrender Hannibal or face war. This was nothing more than a political stunt. Carthage knew that handing over their greatest general, the man who had rebuilt their wealth and power, would be an act of total political surrender, a national humiliation. They refused, citing Rome's own moral failure over Sardinia. The Roman ambassador, Quintus Fabius Maximus, then dramatically gathered up a fold of his official cloak and declared, "Here in my cloak I carry peace and war. Which of the two do you choose?" The Carthaginian senator, showing his own cynical resignation, replied, "Choose for us." Fabius flung out the cloak and announced, "Then I give you war." The Carthaginian assembly roared back, "We accept it." This famous moment was not a sudden decision, but the unavoidable end result of decades of ethical breakdown. The water that linked them, the Mediterranean Sea, was about to become a torrent of blood, and the fault was shared equally by both sides for their complete failure of fights. We must take a moment to understand the true nature of this diplomatic exchange. Neither side genuinely wanted peace, but both desperately wanted the world to see them as the injured party, the morally good victim forced into a righteous war. This is a common and sad pattern in the corruption of great powers, the invention of a righteous story to hide a basic desire for conquest. Rome craved total control of the Mediterranean. Carthage craved an end to Roman interference and the secure possession of their Spanish silver. The people of Saguntum, innocent victims trapped between two giant powers, were simply a useful sacrifice in this cold, heartless game of political chess. The war that erupted, the Second Punic War, was quickly shaped not just by military planning, but by Hannibal's deep personal quest for revenge against the system he saw as fundamentally corrupt. His legendary march over the Alps, an act of incredible planning and unbelievable human suffering, was his way of declaring that he would bring the fight directly to Rome's own territory. For the Romans, this was the ultimate moral test. How does a republic built on strong moral rules react when its entire social and political structure is threatened by a force driven by decades of legitimate anger? Hannibal's battle plan was based on a simple, deep truth about Roman hypocrisy. He knew Rome did not treat its Italian allies as equals, but as servants forced to provide men and supplies. His main goal was not necessarily to conquer Rome itself, but to break the Italian alliance, offering freedom and a better deal to those who switched sides. He aimed to expose Rome's internal moral rot, its cruel treatment of its own supposed allies for all the world to see. And for a few terrifying years this plan worked perfectly, spreading fear and doubt across Italy. The battles of Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and the most crushing of all, Cannae, were more than just military defeats. They were psychological and ethical earthquakes that tore through the core of the Republic. At Cannae, where perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 Romans died in one single day, the Republic faced complete collapse. The moral question was no longer about broken treaties with Carthage, but about whether the Roman virtues, that combination of courage, duty, and moral integrity, was tough enough to survive this sheer total bloodbath. The horrifying scale of the killing forced Rome to make choices that would forever change its ethical boundaries. In the terrible aftermath of Cannae, Rome's response was a strange mix of grim determination and desperate, shocking measures. They started recruiting slaves into their legions, a radical and humiliating break from their military tradition, promising them freedom in exchange for service. They even sank to the level of performing a ritual human sacrifice in the Forum, burying 2 Greeks and 2 Gauls alive, a terrifying ancient religious rite intended to calm their angry gods, a true sign of their absolute, blinding panic. These frantic acts show a state willing to throw away its most sacred principles, social, military, and religious, in the face of total annihilation. The price of their earlier moral compromises was now being paid in vast amounts of human life and a fundamental shattering of their cultural norms. Meanwhile, Hannibal's presence in Italy did start to crack the Roman alliance. Capua, Tarentum, and other vital cities defected, choosing the Carthaginian general over the Roman Senate. Their defection was a harsh judgment on Roman rule, an acknowledgement that the promise of freedom from a vengeful Punic general was better than the protection of the increasingly demanding Roman system. This was the exact moment Hannibal's moral strategy was meant to succeed, to show the world that Rome was a bully and an exploiter, not a true protector. Yet the very hatred he carried and the brutal efficiency of his army ultimately turned against him. The reason Hannibal's moral campaign failed lay in the harsh reality of war and the long shadow of his own methods. Though he offered freedom, Hannibal had no permanent, stable system to guarantee it, and his army, mostly composed of foreign mercenaries, still brought the chaos and violence of war to the Italian countryside. The Romans, though hated, were the familiar enemy. Furthermore, Rome had a secret, hidden moral strength, their absolute refusal to surrender, their grim, unwavering patience. This was not the fights they had failed to show Carthage, but the gravitas, the heavy sense of duty and determination that they showed to their remaining allies. They refused to even discuss surrender, creating a stark contrast. Hannibal offered liberation backed by a temporary, transient army. Rome offered crushing certainty and the promise of a total, terrifying revenge against anyone who defected. The moral story slowly began to change. As Hannibal settled into the south of Italy, the war turned into a stalemate, a slow, draining process of exhaustion. The years passed, and the Romans, having learned not to face him directly after, Cannae adopted the clever strategy of Fabius Maximus. Simply follow and harass, denying Hannibal supplies and allowing the brutal logistics of maintaining a huge foreign army in enemy territory to slowly starve him out. This was a war of sheer endurance, patience, and economic strength. And in this cruel game of attrition, the Roman moral structure, flawed as it was, proved far more resilient than the Carthaginian structure, which relied entirely on the genius of one man and the silver from a distant mine. The true moral failure of Carthage was not in fighting the war, but in failing to give Hannibal full, unwavering support once he was there. The ruling class, the faction that still prioritized peace and trade in Carthage, remained deeply suspicious and jealous of the immense power and ambition of the Barca family. They sent reinforcements and supplies only reluctantly, complaining bitterly about the cost. Their national vision was split. Some saw the war as a fight for national survival. Others saw it as a massive, expensive interruption to profitable trade. This internal division, this failure of national purpose, was the final fatal moral flaw of Carthage. Their personal greed for commerce and their political fear of centralized military power prevented them from fully committing to the war their general was in the process of winning. Imagine the absolute frustration of Hannibal, the greatest military mind of his era, having broken the enemy and now sitting in Italy, waiting for the supplies that never fully arrived, for the reinforcements that were always too few and too late. He was betrayed not by a Roman general, but by the cold, divided priorities of his own leaders. This betrayal, rooted deeply in the financial self-interest and political jealousy of the Carthaginian elite, sealed the fate of their entire empire far more certainly than any Roman legion ever could. It was the ultimate irony of their mercenary system turning against itself. While Hannibal was stuck in Italy, watching his window of opportunity slowly close, a new, younger Roman general was rising quickly: Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio was the opposite of Hannibal in many ways. A political master, a fiercely inspiring leader, and a man who understood that the Punic Wars would be won not just by physical force, but by a strategic, powerful moral counter-narrative. Scipio proposed something truly shocking: attacking Carthage itself. To the old traditional Roman Senate, this idea was pure madness. It was a complete abandonment of the traditional Roman defense-first philosophy, a move of terrifying, reckless boldness. Yet Scipio saw the fundamental weakness in Carthage: its dependence on hired armies, its fragile economy, and its deep political divisions. He recognized that the ultimate failure of Carthage was that its soul remained purely mercantile and profit-driven, while Rome, for all its moral failures, still held a core, unbreakable belief in its own divine destiny and military supremacy. Scipio's conquest of Spain was the turning point. By systematically destroying the Carthaginian presence there, he cut off the silver mines, the financial heart that fueled Hannibal's entire operation. He fought the war with a new, terrifying Roman ruthlessness, but he also showed a political intelligence that won him the respect of the Iberian tribes, successfully persuading many of them to switch their allegiance from Carthaginian control to Roman alliance. This was Rome finally learning the most bitter lesson of the war. Alliances must be earned and nurtured with respect, not simply taken and exploited with force. The moral atmosphere surrounding Scipio's eventual invasion of North Africa was heavy with historical irony. Rome was now the aggressor, bringing the total war they had so desperately tried to avoid onto the very homeland of their rival. The roles were completely reversed. Carthage, unable to defeat Scipio in Africa with its current forces, was forced to recall Hannibal, the man they had selfishly starved of resources and trust to rush home and defend the city. This was the final, devastating admission of their own complete political and moral failure. They had a general who could defeat Rome, but they lacked the internal strength and unity to back him up until the end. The final confrontation at Zama in 202 BC was a spectacular duel between the two greatest minds of the ancient world, Hannibal and Scipio, but it was also a clash between two deeply flawed moral philosophies. Hannibal fought for a vengeance rooted in personal and national betrayal. Scipio fought for a Roman dominance rooted in an arrogant belief in its own unavoidable superiority. When the dust finally cleared, Hannibal was defeated. The terms of the peace treaty dictated by Rome were not merely harsh. They were designed for total, permanent, systematic submission. Carthage was forced to pay a crushing indemnity payment, crippling its economy for decades. It was forced to surrender its entire fleet of warships, effectively ending its status as a major naval power. Most crucially, it was forbidden from waging war outside of Africa, and even within Africa, it was forbidden from fighting without Rome's direct, explicit permission. This last rule was the ultimate act of strategic moral aggression. It left Carthage completely vulnerable to its aggressive, land-hungry Numidian neighbors, particularly King Massinissa, a client king directly controlled by Rome. The decades following the war became a slow-motion political execution ordered by Rome. Carthage, severely wounded but not yet dead, showed a remarkable ability to recover economically, quickly repaying the indemnity and rebuilding its commercial power. This recovery terrified the Romans. Men like the old senator, Cato the Elder, driven by a profound, almost religious hatred and a constant fear of Carthage's return, began ending every single one of his speeches in the Senate with the famous chilling phrase, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. This deep-seated sentiment reveals the final, most terrifying moral corruption of Rome. They had thoroughly defeated their rival, totally subdued them, and secured their own supremacy. Yet their fear was so great and their lust for total, absolute control was so consuming that they could not tolerate the very existence of a recovering civilization. They demanded not simply surrender, but oblivion. This was greed and paranoia fully transforming into an impulse for total annihilation. The direct reason for the final Third War was the treaty clause regarding Numidia. King Massinissa, knowing Carthage could not fight back without Roman consent, began a systematic, continuous campaign of border attacks, land theft, and appropriation of Carthaginian property. Carthage appealed to Rome repeatedly, begging Rome to step in and enforce the very peace treaty Rome itself had written. Rome responded by sending commissions including Cato, who consistently sided with their client king Massinissa. This was Rome openly allowing and encouraging the slow destruction of its defeated foe, a calculated continuous act of betrayal of its own written peace terms. The final, desperate moral choice for Carthage was whether to endure this slow, painful death or to defy Rome and fight for its own desperate self-preservation. In 150 BC, they finally broke the treaty and launched a military response against Massinissa's continuing theft. Rome had the perfect casus belli, the excuse for war it had so cold-heartedly maneuvered for over decades. The Third Punic War began with a Roman demand that the Carthaginians completely abandon their great city and resettle miles inland. This was a non-negotiable death sentence for a civilization built on trade and the sea. The Carthaginians, finally united by the sheer, undeniable terror of Rome's intentions, chose to fight to the very last breath. The siege of Carthage was an act of terrible, methodical cruelty that lasted 3 agonizing years. The city, which had paid the price for decades of its own leaders' greed and lack of moral focus, fought with a desperate, unified ferocity that completely shocked the Romans. Every temple, every house became a makeshift fortress. Women famously cut off their long hair to provide ropes for the siege weapons. Slaves were freed and armed to defend the walls. It was a final, tragic redemption of the Carthaginian spirit, but it was far too late to change their fate. When the city finally fell in 146 BC, the Romans conducted a systematic, week-long slaughter. The huge city was set ablaze and burned uncontrollably for 17 days. The few survivors were sold into slavery. The final, shocking act was the complete, physical obliteration of the city's structure. The Roman Senate ordered the site plowed over and declared sacre accursed and utterly forbidden to be rebuilt. They wanted not just a victory, but the erasure of a civilization from the face of the earth. The total destruction of Carthage was a landmark moment, not of Roman military success, but of Roman moral decay. The sheer overwhelming brutality and the terrifying finality of the act signaled a profound and ugly shift in the Roman mind. They had moved from being a republic willing to negotiate a stern peace to an imperial power, demanding the total non-existence of its rivals. There were no further political gains left to be made. There was only the cold, hard elimination of a lingering fear, a final, absolute grab at the total mastery of the Mediterranean world. What was tragically lost was not just a great city or a powerful empire, but the very concept of balanced power, of a world with more than one great force. The total removal of Carthage took away the only true and meaningful check on Roman ambition. Rome was now the single unquestioned sovereign, and in the absence of an external unifying enemy, the moral corruption that had been silently growing in its political elite began to turn violently inwards. The wealth seized from the Punic Wars, the huge influx of cheap slaves, the vast amounts of new land acquired in Spain and Africa, all of this broke the back of the independent Roman farmer, creating a huge urban underclass and vast politically powerful landed estates. It fueled the social inequality and the ruthless political infighting that would characterize the next century of Roman history, leading directly to the ultimate collapse of the very republic that had finally vanquished its greatest foe. The triumph was, in a deeper sense, the beginning of the end. If you're still watching this far, you might share this journey with others who'd be just as shocked. The terrifying lesson here is that history is rarely a simple story of good against evil, but a horrifying record of which power is ultimately more coldly efficient in its own moral corruption. The ghost of Carthage would continue to haunt Rome for centuries, a silent, terrifying reminder of what happens when national ambition is left totally unchecked. In the single-minded pursuit of total dominion, Rome had crossed a moral boundary that could never be uncrossed. The water that began as a symbol of shared prosperity and controlled rivalry had ended as a vast sea of blood, and the dark stain of that choice never truly faded. The lessons of the Punic Wars are simple, agonizing, and forever relevant. In the beginning, two great powers failed to trust their own agreements, choosing selfish, immediate gain over the lasting weight of true honesty. Carthage failed because of the paralysis of a greedy, divided ruling class, who betrayed their own most brilliant general out of short-sighted self-interest. Rome failed through a relentless systemic hypocrisy, using written treaties as temporary tools of control and ultimately choosing annihilation over sustained coexistence. The final horrifying truth is that the moral failure of one power simply gave the other the perfect excuse to indulge its own worst, darkest tendencies. Hannibal's personal vengeance became Rome's complete, unchallengeable license for total, merciless conquest. The true corruption was the foolish, arrogant belief that an absolute victory, the total destruction of a rival, could secure an absolute lasting peace. Instead, the total removal of all external threats merely allowed the internal diseases of the Roman system, the endless lust for land, the rising power of the military generals, the exploitation of the poor to accelerate into a fatal, unstoppable cancer. Rome took the wealth and power of Carthage, but it also absorbed the deep, corrosive poison of its own mercilessness. The selfish compromise over Sardinia, the cynical maneuver at Saguntum, the deliberate genocidal destruction of a great city, these were the dark precedents that would later be used by Roman generals against Roman citizens and by emperors against the very idea of the republic itself. In the end, the Punic Wars were not a victory for Roman morality, but the terrifying moment. Rome completely sold its soul for power, setting the inevitable stage for the moral decay that would centuries later consume the Republic from within, a chilling warning that still echoes through our own time.